the garden tomb, and he carried with him to the cross the patibulum, that's that crossbeam going across his shoulders, but after he was dead, they took him down from the cross. It was very nasty old business. They had to use a pair of pliers to take those nails out. Now, you imagine, Yemi, the first thing they have to do is put a piece of cloth over his face. If somebody died outside on the road, the first thing you do is cover the face. So that's what they did. So if you look at that picture there, they used that little napkin or handkerchief called in Greek a sudarium, okay? And then they covered his body with a long piece of cloth, 14 foot long and 3.5 feet wide, called a sindon or a thonia in the scriptures. And that's what they did. So there's that picture. That's what they did. They only had between 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Jesus died and 6 o'clock in the evening when Passover started to cover him. And can you see that big piece of cloth on the right-hand side? That's what it looks like. And they used that bit of cloth to wind Jesus, to cover Jesus' body and put him in the garden tomb. So they put him in the garden tomb. There he is, going in the garden tomb. And the tomb was owned by Joseph of Arimathea. And by the way, Jesus only borrowed it for 3 days and 3 nights, didn't he? and then Joseph of Arimathea can have it back again. Anyway, they rolled that big stone across there, and then they put that seal across there, and then they nailed that spike in. And by the way, Yemi, that spike is still there. You can go and touch it. Have you been to the garden tomb?
I've been to the
Okay, well, next time you go there, you go and touch that. That is a 1st century Roman spike. Wow. It's covered in lead. Anyway, then Jesus, he died, of course, he was dead, so his spirit was in paradise, and he was preaching to all those who were drowned in Noah's flood, but his body was still in the garden tomb in that little place there. But it says in Psalm 16 that his body wouldn't decompose. So, I wasn't there, you weren't there, but sometime after 3 days and 3 nights, he was resurrected, and it was a tremendous burst. Now, I believe something happened that caused the image to come on the shroud, because there's no paint on that shroud. So something dramatic happened to cause the paint come on the shroud. The resurrection happened, which we're going to talk about later, and it's a bit like what happened at the Transfiguration. We'll talk about that later, and there's a release of nuclear energy, and that is how the photo-negative image got on the shroud. So if you'd like to look at that, that's what the shroud looks like, that photo-negative image, and we're going to be talking about how it got there in three-dimensional image. So after 3 days, Jesus came back to life again. And let me tell you something really interesting. You know, Peter and John, they went in there, and he said they saw something and they believed. Now, what did they saw? They saw those 2 pieces of cloth, sudarium, or the athonia, that's the large piece of cloth. And the sudarium is the little handkerchief on one side, and then the sindon, or the athonia. But what they probably saw was a fresh scorch mark on the huge piece of cloth of the resurrection. I'm sure they saw an empty tomb. By the way, the great big stone only went back so that they could get in. Jesus can walk through stones. So, so they didn't, do you know what I mean? They only the angel rolled the stone back so that Peter and Mary and Peter and James could get in there, not so that Jesus could get out. That's an important point. But anyway, when they got in there, they saw and believed. Well, what do they see? Well, they saw, first of all, these 2 pieces of cloth, but more importantly, well, I think what they saw is these scorch marks, freshly made. You know, if you've got I'm terrible at ironing. When I iron my shirts or whatever, sometimes I talk to my wife and we get chatting and, oops, I've made a scorch mark on my white shirt. Well, that's what they saw on the Shroud of Turin, you see. That's what they saw. And they saw an image of Jesus Christ. And they thought, wow, he's done what he said he's going to do. He's risen from the dead.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You know what? If you want to join us in this discussion today, you have questions or you have comments, you know, you want to contribute to the discussion, you can send your emails through to live@revelationtv.com. live@revelationtv.com. And if you want to send a text, the numbers are on the screen, so we'll read everything out. So God bless you, and I hope you enjoy what you're hearing. But you haven't heard anything yet. God bless you. Now, so what normally happened at a Jewish burial, like the burial of Lazarus?
Okay. Now, again, we need to look at the pictures because I think it's just easier to understand pictures. Okay, a normal Jewish burial, get it right, Lazarus was buried in bandages. And in the Greek, they're called kairos. People say the Shroud of Turin isn't in the New Testament. It jolly well is. We just have to understand the Greek. So his face was covered in a napkin, It's called a sudarian, but his body was covered in bandages, and they're called kairos.
So that's Lazarus.
That's Lazarus, sorry. Okay. Lazarus in the grave. It took 6 hours, you know. It took 6 hours. And by the way, when the two Marys came on the Sunday morning, they came with a great big pot of ointment and stuff, and they were going to do this for Jesus. They were going to cover him with bandages and all the ointment and the myrrh and the aloes and everything else, but they didn't have a chance because he had risen from the dead, you see. So Lazarus was buried in grave windings, or kairos, around his body, with this napkin or sudarian around his head. And that's basically what happened in a normal one. We know that sudarian means a napkin because in the book of Acts, in Acts 18 actually, or Acts 19, sorry, Paul actually gave sudarians around to heal the sick. It's called napkins or handkerchiefs, but the actual Greek is sudarian, you see. And so that's basically what happened. Now, the burial of Jesus was quite different. Shall we talk about the burial of Jesus now?
That's very important.
Because it's quite different. You see, with the burial of Jesus, they only had this short time. They had 3 hours, 3 o'clock in the afternoon until 6 o'clock in the evening. That's when Passover started. And they had to get everything done and dusted by 6 o'clock in the evening. So what did they do? They got hold of, Jesus was buried in these 2 different cloths. First of all, the sudarian. The Shroud of Turin is in the Bible. I'm going to show you that. First of all, the sindon, or the athonia. Now, the sindon is like a sail. Now, we know it's like a sail because in the book of Acts, Peter had a vision, and he saw all these animals coming down in a great... oh, sorry, I got this wrong, sorry. Start again. A sindon, that's in the book of Mark. Let's go back to the book of Mark. I'm going through my slides too quickly, actually. The sindon is described in the book of Mark in Mark 15, and it says, let me put my glasses on to read this, actually. And it says, Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy guy who owned the garden tomb, he bought fine linen. The Greek word is sindon. And they took him down and wrapped him in this linen. That's the sindon, and they laid him in the tomb. All right? But also in Mark, it also used the word sindon, also in Mark, in the chapter before. So let's see what it says. It says in Mark 14, it says, now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth, that's a sindon, thrown around his naked body. So that was Mark. Mark had this huge piece of cloth around his body. And you remember the story, he left it in Gethsemane, and he ran away naked. But this piece of cloth wasn't just a little bit of bandage. This was a huge big piece of cloth to cover the whole of Mark. So it covered, similar piece of cloth covered the whole of Jesus too. But also, it's also called an athonia. And we know what an athonia is too. Because in Acts chapter 10, if you remember, Peter was sort of having a little bit of a sleep on the roof, and he saw all these animals coming down in a great sheet. The Greek word is athonia. So that's what this Shroud of Turin, it's an athonia or a sindon. It's nothing like bandages. It's a great big piece of cloth, and that's exactly what it is. So there we are. So that's what they did with Jesus. And by the way, the napkin that they put over his face, the sudarium, is still around. It's actually in Spain in a place called Oviedo. And there's that picture of it, and it's got the same blood marks as on the Shroud of Turin. And it's very important, this shroud. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo, because they know the history of this, and they know it came from at least 600. They know a guy called Philip came from Jerusalem, and he brought it there. And it's got the same blood marks as on the Shroud of Turin. It's been very carefully analysed by Dr. Alan Wanger, who's a emeritus professor, and he says it comes from the same person. Well, if it comes from the same person, and this Sudarium of Oviedo in Spain, we know that it comes from before the 7th century, well, they got their dating wrong, but we'll look at that later.
Wonderful.
There we go. All right.
Tell us, what do you think is responsible for his own burial being different from that of Lazarus? Because you said Lazarus had bandages all over. Yeah. And in this case...
Well, so that's really good. See, it's really interesting. See, a burial, in those days, they used to put people in like a cave, and then they would come back after a while, and after all the flesh had decayed, and they put the bones in an ossuary. So you could have one cave or grave and use it for lots of members of the family and put all their bones in an ossuary. But what they did is they took